Greetings and bienvenue, MITZU. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
There exists for all people a point where the quantity of coincidences exceeds what one is willing to accept as coincidence. For a skeptic, this point is rather high, while for the naive, it might very well be one. Long have I thought of myself as a skeptic, particularly in regards to the paranormal. A scientist by trade, I never accept any evidence that is non-repeatable, nor do I accept theories based on small numbers of events. I feel the need to preface my story with this short paragraph so that when I present my experiences, you understand the viewpoint at which I approach them. I grew up in a small house occupied by many members of my extended family. As such, rare was the moment in which I was ever alone in a room. Save time spent in the bathroom, someone was always within line of sight. College was much the same, having shared a rather small suite with 3 other students. Being alone was not a sensation I encountered until my late 20s, having had to live a rather Spartan life upon discovering my chosen vocation left work opportunities few and far between, typically tackling this issue by living in small apartments with many other individuals. I was 28 when I obtained my apartment. My apartment, no one else had any claim to the space. It was a 2-bedroom apartment, 1 bedroom utilized as my home office and the other for sleeping. I landed a job with the CDC near Washington, D.C., and even though the cost of living was higher than what I was used to in the Midwest, the pay was more than enough for me to find adequate living space within my budget. I was ecstatic at first, but my enthusiasm rapidly dwindled. The first nights were difficult. I often thought I was hearing noises within the walls, and after a few days I took to leaving the television on across the hall. This helped me sleep a bit, but the noises continued. Eventually I was content to drown them out with music at night. I had lived in places with rats in the walls and old buildings that creaked many times before, but somehow this was different. These weren't the intermittent squeak of the floor, nor the persistent chewing and skittering of a rat swarm. Odd rhythms with inconsistent breaks filled the nocturnal orchestra. Irregular beats, consistent sounds expressed in patterns I could not follow. The predictability of the music I played over it clashed heavily with the ever-present undersound. Additionally, the noises seemed to get louder the more ambient noise was present. I first noted this phenomenon on a Saturday night when a rather eventful occurrence must have left the patrons at a nearby bar incredibly excited when they took to the streets at last call. I was awake finishing a manuscript when their merriment took to the streets, and rather than notice the commotion caused by the inebriated, I first became aware of an inexplicable uptick in the level of sound coming from within my home. This noise was what broke me from my concentration, and only after it did so did I become aware of the people outside. I began experimenting with the sound, recording it, manipulating it. The volume increases linearly with the volume of other sounds, based on some rough audio analysis. I took to sleeping with earplugs and silencing all other sounds in my apartment, such as to appease whatever is making the noises. I presented the sound files and my analysis to a coworker in confidence after some time. I had little to fear regarding questions of my insanity, as I had taken some video footage as proof of the location and timing of the events. He was intrigued, but insisted it was most likely something mundane. My theory that some sort of creature or creatures were reacting to the ambient noise levels was rapidly rejected, and I felt rather silly. Still, something was occurring, and he offered to come help me seek out the source of the noise on the following weekend. We grabbed dinner that Saturday evening, and he and I retired to my apartment shortly after sunset. The point of the evening was locating the source of the noise, and that is what we set our minds to upon entering my apartment. Or rather, that is what we were planning on setting our minds to when we arrived. The noise was, disappointingly, absent. He stayed for a few hours more, however, and we watched a movie. His presence seems to have kept the sound away. When he left, I went to sleep and slept more soundly than I had since moving. There were no sounds that night. I kept busy on Sunday, barely setting foot into my apartment. While the previous night was pleasant, it quickly faded into memory as I went about running errands and keeping the rest of my life in order. I had more energy than I knew what to do with, and I meant to make the most of it. I was drained by the end of the day, but I had accomplished many tasks that I would otherwise have continued putting off. I dined alone and went to bed early. Predictably, the sounds returned. The sounds remained a constant in my life for some time, and while they were present, I simply put up with them. Eventually, the previously mentioned coworker wound up spending the night for different reasons. I hadn't even thought of the sounds, nor had I mentioned them to him again since that first night. With him there, they were again absent. After a few more months, we moved in together, him and I, living in my apartment. When my lease ended, we moved to a larger place and had been there around a year without incident. This week, however, he left for a conference that, due to a few projects at work, I was unable to attend. The noises began the night he left 3 days ago. I recognized them instantly and was unable to sleep. I immediately set up an audio recorder, as well as my laptop recording video and sound. They were louder than ever before and clearer. I spent all of yesterday reviewing the recordings and analyzing the sound files from before, comparing now and then. Several aspects remained consistent between the recordings, and I am certain that they are the same noise. This time, however, I captured something different. The recorder I use for work is a new one, and seems to have picked up more of the sound than my laptop and other devices. I can understand it now. There are voices, alien and unsettling voices, as though someone taught a pack of cats to speak in disjointed sentences. Snippets of conversations that make no sense, frequently referring to me by name. They know who I am. They seem to be following me, and it appears that they, like me in some twisted sort of way. The creatures want me to know I'm not alone. They don't want me to be sad. They want to make sure I know they're there, that they're watching me. I slept in a hotel last night to get away from them. I couldn't sleep with whatever they were nearby, and hadn't slept the night before. I couldn't sleep much last night either, though. It was almost too quiet. I had to turn the TV on before I could fall asleep. I went home this afternoon, intent on discovering more. A few samples of broken sentences was hardly enough evidence for me to base any conclusion on, and I needed to shake the feeling that I've gone crazy. I borrowed a few more recorders from work and set them up around my home, at least one in every room. The plan was to discover where the noises were coming from, based on where the voices were loudest and clearest. They started shortly after dark, predictably. The sound files were sent to my laptop every few minutes, and I compared them on the fly. Consistently, they are loudest in whichever room I'm in, or in whichever room has the highest levels of ambient noise. Dishwasher and microwave created this pattern. The clarity, however, seems directly linked to my location and my location only. The longer I stay in a place, the better I can understand them. I can hear them, right now. I know what they're saying. I don't have to be alone again. I don't have to be alone, ever. I just have to let them in. I don't want to be alone. I guess that's why I have this hammer, huh? I just need to let them into the house so they can be with me, so we can be together. The more I listen, the better it sounds. I can hardly remember why I even left last night, why I would ever want to be alone. I'm going to let them in. I need to find out what they are, why they're here. If I come back, I'll post the audio. If I don't, well, someone will find the recordings. They'll be missed in rather short order. Wish me luck. At least I know someone will know what happened to me if I go missing.
I also posted this on my website. I run a blog about cold cases, but for some reason I can't see it. I've tried posting it at least 15 times, but I'm not getting anywhere. So I really hope this post uploads. I live in Mammoth, Arizona, and nothing has ever happened here worth writing about because, well, Mammoth has a population of around 1,500. 11 days ago, on the 3rd, an older woman who runs a home daycare in my town was found dead in her bathroom by a parent who was picking up his daughter. The kids were all really agitated and told police that Mrs. Booker, the deceased, had been yelling at them and bleeding from her eye before she went into the bathroom and collapsed in her bathtub. Sad and unpleasant, but not really news. But a day later, one of the daycare babies developed a rash and started bleeding from her ear. She died 12 hours later, and so did 8 other kids from that daycare, all with similar symptoms. This started a shitstorm in my town. In a town of 1,500 people, attempts to keep people unaware and calm were an utter failure. It was on Facebook by the following day. 9 people who had been at the hospital when the kids were starting to trickle in also started exhibiting these symptoms, I'm told. None lasted more than a few days. By last Friday, 18 people who had indirect contact with the children were reported missing or dead of natural or unknown causes. All had exhibited similar symptoms just before their deaths. It was at this point that I became directly affected. My sister returned from Oro Valley, the closest hospital, a complete wreck. She had gone to visit her friend's new baby, and upon arriving had been informed that both her friend and her baby had died. Everything I just told you was told to her by a frightened nurse. I fact-checked what I could. My sister was literally hysterical. She was speaking a full octave higher than usual and at twice the speed. I have never seen her act like that before. Her shoulders and arms had bruises so big, I thought maybe she'd been in a car accident on the way home. She told me she didn't know where she'd gotten them, and when I tried to put her to bed, she freaked out and started screaming at me that my bedroom was too hot. I took her temperature, which was 102.8. I convinced her to go to bed. I fell asleep on the couch shortly after waiting for a call back from our town's ME. I woke up to my phone going off. I had 7 texts from friends of mine all reporting the same thing. Entire families were being found beaten to death all over Mammoth. Blood, bruises, nails and teeth missing, hair ripped out. All of them. I heard reports of anywhere from 14 to 55 dead bodies, depending on who you were talking to. In a state of complete shock, I did the only thing I could do really well on autopilot. I wrote an article about it for my blog. I made some calls around the city, but my usual contacts weren't picking up. I went to check on my sister and she was bleeding from her ear, heavily. Between that and the bruising, I started to wonder if these were actually home invasions at all. I called the 24-hour urgent care in town, but no one picked up. I didn't want to risk driving her back to Oro Valley. I then tried 911, which also rang endlessly. I called my friend in Oro who works for a legit news agent, and she told me that they were reporting Northwest Medical was running a skeleton crew because most of the medical staff had either called in sick or been found dead in their homes. She said she'd seen tanks in Oro. I woke up the next morning and my sister was gone. I don't know where she is and I'm too scared to go looking for her. I have called the CDC multiple times, but every time I call, the same woman answers. The first time she took a statement and said she'd get back to me. Every subsequent time I've called, she immediately puts me on hold. She never comes back to the line. This morning, my contact at the police department finally called me back. He told me the death toll is incalculable at this point and that they are being iced out by both the state and federal governments at this point, with one exception. 2 people from the CDC showed up yesterday. My contact overheard them talking about Mrs. Booker's cancer treatments as if it were relevant. He doesn't know if it is, but he hopes I can make something out of it. I can't. I don't know about Oro, but my estimation for Mammoth itself is around 40 dead after showing the same symptoms. I haven't seen any of this in the news, which I've been watching religiously. Why not? We have been told the safest place for us right now is inside our homes. I haven't seen a car pass down my street in 2 days. I'm scared. My sister is still missing, but I'm too afraid to look for her or go into the room she was sleeping in. My hair is falling out from stress. I've been smoking like crazy. This morning I noticed a bruise on my arm. I know my immune system is compromised and I'm too afraid to leave my house. I called my parents in Tucson and left a message, but they haven't called back. The last I heard from my friend in Oro was Saturday morning. She texted to tell me they had started to find bodies lying in the street. No one is bothering to collect them anymore. I responded, but she never texted back. I'll update more as soon as I can. Anyone in Oro or Mammoth, please contact me. I haven't seen another human in over 2 days, and I feel like the last person on Earth.
When you live in a big city for a certain amount of time, you stop noticing some things. Crowded sidewalks don't seem bad anymore. You learn to ignore the police sirens at all hours of the night, the smell of trash mixed with exhaust and street food. But the first things you get used to are the pigeons. They're everywhere all the time. Aside from occasionally taking a shit on your car, they really don't do anything to draw attention to themselves. They're pretty much content to sit on buildings and run around sidewalks trying to eat crumbs of food that people drop, at least, until 3 weeks ago. I was walking across the campus to get to the library, since I needed to work on a paper and needed to have physical sources for some reason. I stopped by one of the dining halls for some breakfast, or if you name meals by the time you eat them, lunch. And as I was leaving it, I saw a group of people standing in a circle in the outdoor eating area. Curious, I walked over to see what was happening. There was a pigeon in the middle of the, wandering in circles and making the oddest sound I've ever heard come from a bird. It was making a very low rumble, almost as if it was belching. The sounds came at odd intervals but always lasted 2 seconds. Occasionally its wings would flutter as if it was about to fly away, but it never lifted off. There were scraps of food on the ground. Apparently someone had tried to feed it. Someone in the crowd suggested that the food had been poisoned, and it certainly seemed to be a reasonable explanation when the bird fell over and went silent. With nothing left to keep their attention, the crowd began to disperse then, while some lingered as they tried to upload the video they took with their smartphones. I was in the former group, and as such wasn't right there when the screeching started. It was a horrible, shrill sound. The closest I could get to describing it would be the sound of squealing tires, but an octave higher and more organic sounding. At first, we weren't sure where the sound came from, but when one of the people who had stayed by the pigeon started screaming, we knew. It was a girl that I vaguely recognized as a theater major who had a bit part in some Shakespearean comedy last year. She was grabbing at her face and spinning as she screamed over the screeching, and it looked like she was bleeding. Everyone was stunned by the sights and sounds in front of them, and it took a while before anyone thought to help her. Another guy who had stayed went over to her, and from my vantage point it looked like he grabbed her face. They stood, fighting with whatever they had in their hands, until he pulled away and threw some gray and red thing to the ground. The girl ran away, and he looked down at the still screeching thing. He was about to crush it with his foot when it flew up at his face, and at the same time the pitch of the screech began to sharply rise. It stopped suddenly as the gray thing disappeared into a flash of red, accompanied by a slight popping sound like uncorking champagne. It didn't take long to figure out that the gray thing had been the pigeon we were watching before. The circle began to reform, some looking at the bits of feather and skin laying on the ground, and others looking at the man with bird blood and guts covering his face. He was in shock, it appeared. It couldn't have been more than a minute before the campus police and an ambulance showed up to take care of the theater girl and her rescuer. Her face was cut up fairly badly, but she had managed to protect her eyes. The guy was uninjured as far as they could tell, just shaken up and covered in the bird's remains. At that point, I continued on to the library. I tried to work on my paper for some time, but I was distracted by the scene I had witnessed earlier. Jumping on the internet, I searched for exploding pigeons. I expected to see some videos from earlier show up amongst clips of pigeons being obliterated by various firearms. I wasn't prepared for news articles from all over the world about similar situations. It seemed to be happening most frequently in Venice of all places, where at least one person was confirmed to actually have been pecked to death by one of the frenzied birds before its explosive end, and several others had drowned after falling into the canals. There were also unconfirmed reports of other birds exhibiting similar symptoms, as it was believed to be some kind of disease, but so far the only physical evidence supported it just being pigeons that were affected. It was eerie to read the news while listening to the occasional screeching pigeon outside the library walls. This outbreak continued the rest of the day, and then waned during the night. The next day there were a lot fewer incidents, but it was noted that there weren't many pigeons around anymore. The media looked to science for an answer, which was incredibly stupid as this had only been happening for one day. There was no chance they had already figured it out. Of course, this didn't stop the interviews, with rather unscientific minds jumping to conclusions about what was happening. I followed the news rather closely the rest of the day, but I couldn't the next day because I had class. so now I was left with getting news in the afternoon, which I did for the rest of the week. There wasn't much. Constant no progress in search for a cause updates, a few continuing outbreaks, and still more guessing games about what new disease or solar radiation or government conspiracy was causing this. Nothing changed the weekend after the beginning of the event, and it seemed that most of the students here had stopped caring. I hadn't seen a pigeon since Wednesday evening, so it seemed we were done with the outbreak. In class Tuesday morning 2 weeks ago, I was in class when I heard this odd sound. It was a rhythmic banging coming from the classroom on the floor below mine. I honestly didn't pay much attention to it until I heard the sound of glass shattering, and the thumping sound stopped at exactly that moment. The professor told us to stay in the room while he went down to check it out. After he left the room, several people declared class over and left. I left for a different reason. I wanted to know what had happened. My professor, the one who had been teaching in the room below us, and several professors from other nearby rooms were standing around the door, looking in through the glass window on it. They were talking to each other in hushed tones, but I heard 3 things clearly: police, bit me, and bath salts. I got closer to the door and tried to look in over the professors, but one saw me and told me to get back to class. I decided to go back to my dorm to get my laptop and watch the news about what happened here, so I left the building. I looked over to the side and saw that one room's window was broken. I knew that was the room, and I knew that what I was thinking was incredibly stupid, but there was no way I was talking myself out of it. I crept over and peeked in and saw someone wandering about the room in jerking bouts of movement. I also heard something. Every now and then there was a low, gurgling moan coming out of the room. It was almost the same sound I heard the pigeon making on the day the outbreak started. I pulled out my phone to get a video of it, hoping the sound was loud enough to get picked up, and then I left as quickly as I could while keeping quiet. I watched the video when I got back to my room. I wanted to make sure the sound was captured before uploading it anywhere. That was when I recognized the face of the man. It was the same guy that the pigeon exploded in front of the library. This seemed to imply that the blood had infected him, but it seemed odd that a disease would be able to jump species that quickly. Checking the news, there was nothing new again. Nothing about the species jump. At first I thought that it may not have started in other places yet, or possibly that this was just a coincidence and had nothing to do with the pigeons. But then I remembered what that professor had said, and I searched for news about bath salts, and the reports were everywhere. No one seemed to notice that the most new incidents were occurring in the cities hit hardest by the birds: Moscow, New York City, Venice. Assuming that these were just people on the first day, it looked like things were going to get bad. Bad didn't begin to describe it. As the cases poured in, it became clear that this was not just an increase in bath salts use. It only took a few hours after people began to exhibit symptoms for someone to notice the connection with the pigeons. The media was putting down any insistence that the two were related, bringing in CDC officials to say that it simply was not possible. There was no way for a disease to have appeared so suddenly and then jump that quickly. Other news sources began going with the government conspiracy angle, or at the very least calling it a biological weapon test gone wrong. On Wednesday, reports came in that Venice was almost 100% infected. Helicopters flying above the city reported no one who appeared unaffected. The news ran this story along with the fact that the ratio of pigeons to people in the city had been 3-to-1. It looked like they gave up on hiding the connection. Venice also taught us something. The infected had a sense of self-preservation. They kept away from places where they may fall into the canals, and the few that did end up in the water were unable to swim. My parents called me around noon that day and begged me to leave the city and come home. I agreed and started packing immediately. On my way to my car, I saw the professor from the attacked class and thought I'd go talk to him about what he'd seen. I was walking over and called out to him, but he ignored me and just stood there facing away from me. I walked up to him and tapped on the shoulder, asking what was going on. Slowly, he turned around towards me in a horribly spasmodic way. He looked at me, let out a low, gurgling moan, and tried to grab me. Luckily, the infected are slow, otherwise I would be dead right now. As it is, I managed to get away from him very easily. Getting out of the city was difficult as the traffic was slowed to a halt by the sheer number of people trying to escape. Emergency service vehicles didn't help the travel times at all, nor did the infected roaming the streets. Eventually, I abandoned my car and took an unattended bicycle from the sidewalk. It may have been riskier, but it was faster. It was while I was biking out of the city that I realized the infected didn't explode like the pigeons did. I managed to get out of the city just a few hours before the military showed up and set up barricades. They were keeping everyone inside because they had no way of knowing who had been exposed. I managed to hitchhike my way back to my hometown by that night and slept in my old bed for the first time in over a year. My dad stayed up patrolling the house with a shotgun, and my mother and I slept with guns on our nightstands. Thursday, television went down, replaced by a government warning to stay away from large cities, to keep stocked up on emergency supplies, and to report any infected seen outside a city to a hotline number. Friday, we saw one in our backyard. My dad blew its head off with one shot. It fell over and laid there for several seconds before getting back up. It wandered aimlessly without eyes, ears, or a nose to give it sensory information about where prey was. A second shot, this time to the chest, brought it down for good. We didn't go near it for fear of infection, but we used a digital camera to get a closer look at the body, and there was something inside it that didn't belong. An extra organ growing in the chest. It had been shredded by the shotgun blast, so now we knew why it lived through losing its head. It didn't need a brain anymore. Over the weekend, we had several more infected come, but we never reported them for fear of the government putting our small town on lockdown like the cities. Our neighbors talked of everyone moving into one large, easily defended building and sharing food. My dad didn't agree, but my mom and I thought it was a good idea. On Monday last week, we moved everyone who wanted to go into the school. We sealed the windows in the classrooms that had them as best we could, and mostly set up on the second floor with some people staying in the cafeteria to keep our food supplies safe. We blocked some hallways too, so that they would be more defensible if necessary. Tuesday and Wednesday were uneventful, but Thursday the infected started gathering around the school. The worst part was some of them were military. On Friday they started looking for a way in. We shot some from the second floor windows but decided to save our ammo in case they actually got in. One of them did on Saturday. We're not sure how, but it was walking around the school and managed to attack an older woman before it was killed. On Sunday, that woman became infected. Biting transmits the disease faster than blood. The room she was killed in and the hall with the infected body were blocked off, and we started having organized patrols of the school. This Monday, someone picked up a radio signal from a military patrol. 2 men were discussing the Russians' use of nerve gas to exterminate several cities full of infected. One of them called it deplorable, but the other said we should be doing the same thing. Tuesday, we were all woken up by a horrible screaming. It was coming from the infected. Their chests were pulsing in a horrible way, and they were frenzied. They attacked each other, the school, everything around them. It went on for about 2 minutes before we thought about what was happening, and I told everyone to get away from windows. I was the only one who had actually seen what happened with the pigeons. We got people away from any open windows in time, and most of them had no idea what happened when the scream stopped. I was smart enough not to go look, but some others did. I heard them puking when they saw the exploded bodies. We called into the hotline at this time and found out that all of the infected the government knew of had done the same thing. It was over. They said they would send a helicopter out to our school to pick us up from the roof. We would be put under observation for some time, and if we didn't develop the infection, we would be sent to a safe part of the country to live until our homes were cleaned up. Today, Saturday, I write from my room in quarantine. The CDC takes good care of us here. We're all given televisions and radios, and we were allowed to bring anything we had with us, so I have my laptop and cell phone too. We're given 3 meals a day, and some of the researchers like talking to us to keep our spirits up. But today, when I talked to them, it didn't make me feel good like the other days. Today, I was told that a blue jay had exploded on one of the researchers.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more Greentext will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check the Odyssey and Rumble pages for separate archives of previous broadcasts.